for centuries, becoming connected to a king, having him as your son-in-law, was the ultimate ambition for any noble family. But what if that dream came at a terrible cost? The life of your own daughter, as it did with Henry VIII. So, who were the mothers behind his 6 tragic wives? What did they really think of this king? And how did they face the fate of their daughters? That's what we're exploring today. Leave a like and let's dive in. The first mother-in-law of the king with 6 wives was a truly legendary woman. And I think that if Henry VIII had ever come face to face with her, his knees would have started shaking, and he probably would have thought twice before treating her daughter the way he did. We're talking about the powerful Catholic queen, Isabella of Castile. I think Isabella hardly needs an introduction, but if you're hearing her name for the first time, she was the Queen of Castile who, together with her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon, united Spain, laid the foundations of the Spanish Empire, financed Christopher Columbus on his voyages, conquered Granada, and established the Inquisition, which, of course, doesn't exactly add to their charm. But the most important thing you need to understand about Isabella is that she was never just a queen consort and never stood behind her husband. She ruled as his equal, which makes her especially fascinating for a woman living at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. Catherine of Aragon, who would become the first wife of Henry VIII, was the youngest of her parents' surviving children. And in fact, she was never originally meant for Henry at all, but for his older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. And I think it's fair to say that, out of all of Henry's wives, Catherine arguably had the highest status by birth. Yes, Anne of Cleves was also of royal blood, but Catherine came from a far more powerful dynasty. On top of that, she also carried the blood of Edward III of England, which made her distantly related to her future father-in-law, Henry VII of England, and even to her future mother-in-law, Elizabeth of York. While Catherine of Aragon and Arthur were growing up in their respective courts, reaching the right age for marriage, their mothers were constantly writing to each other, sharing updates on how their children were being raised and prepared for this union. And of course, Henry VIII, who at the time was just the spare, barely even entered Isabella's field of vision. When Catherine was 15 and Arthur 14, their parents decided they were old enough, and Catherine set off for England to finally marry her future husband. Arthur himself, after meeting his bride, immediately wrote a letter to her parents, thanking them and expressing his admiration for their daughter. So, Isabella was most likely very pleased with her son-in-law. On November 14, 1501, Catherine was finally married to Arthur in St. Paul's Cathedral. It was an absolutely magnificent ceremony, something the whole country had been preparing for over 2 years, and one of the most lavish weddings in English history, a clear sign of just how important this alliance was for the young Tudor dynasty. After the wedding, the couple was sent to Ludlow Castle, where they were to begin their new roles as Prince and Princess of Wales. But only a few months later, both Catherine and Arthur fell ill with a mysterious sweating sickness. Although it seemed at one point that neither of them would survive, Catherine recovered. But on April 2nd, 1502, Arthur died, leaving his young wife a widow. Isabella and Ferdinand wrote a letter expressing their sorrow over the death of their son-in-law. Of course, this was an incredibly complicated situation. The political alliance that had taken so long to arrange was now under threat. Trying to keep Catherine's dowry, which amounted to an enormous 200,000 ducats, Henry VII, who had also recently lost his wife, began negotiations to marry Catherine himself. But her mother, Isabella, was horrified and strongly opposed the idea. She wrote to her ambassador, "It would be a very evil thing, one never before seen, and the mere mention of which offends the ears. We would not, for anything in the world, that it should take place." As a mother, she had planned a future for her daughter that would bring her a crown, not leave her a widow so soon. And, after all, Isabella herself had married her handsome and relatively young husband out of mutual affection and respect, and she likely could not bear the thought of her daughter being forced to share her life with a man who was already no longer young. And this is where our red-haired boy finally steps onto the scene. He was only about 12 at the time. A new marriage agreement was drawn up. Once Henry turned 14, he would marry Catherine. Isabella even sought special permission for this from the Pope. But none of these plans were meant to come true. In November 1504, Isabella died. For Catherine, the death of her mother was a devastating blow, not only because she mourned her as a parent, but also because she suddenly lost much of her value as a bride on the political stage. As it was said at the time, Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, was far less desirable than Catherine, daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain. So, despite the marriage agreement that was supposed to unite her with Henry in 1505, the wedding was called off at the very last moment. Henry VII withdrew his son from the match. Just imagine the state Catherine must have been in after years of uncertainty, now finding herself a rejected bride. In the end, Henry did marry Catherine, but only in 1509 after his father's death. And she finally became Queen of England, just as she had once been meant to. But all those years in between, this young princess lived in conditions that were shockingly modest for someone of her status, while her father and her father-in-law kept shifting responsibility for her future and her upkeep onto each other. But that's a whole story of its own. All in all, among all of Henry's mothers-in-law, Isabella was by far the most powerful figure. And it's hard not to wonder, if she hadn't died so early, Catherine's fate might have turned out very differently. Perhaps Catherine would have married Henry sooner, and they would have had more time to try for children. Perhaps she wouldn't have had to live in such difficult conditions, which some historians believe may have contributed to her struggles with pregnancy. At the time, she was said to be extremely thin, and possibly dealing with issues around food as well. And maybe, if Isabella had lived longer, Henry would never have dared to treat her daughter the way he eventually did. But even though Isabella died too soon, she still left her mark on this marriage and her influence on Henry. Through her mother's example, Catherine believed that a woman could rule just as well as a man. She took an active role in Henry's affairs, and she truly believed that a woman could inherit the throne. She saw her daughter Mary as a future queen and raised her for that role, just as she herself had been raised. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. Isabella's granddaughter Mary became the first crowned queen in England, continuing this line of ruling women, and in a way, proving her father wrong, the man who never believed a woman could truly rule. The mother of Anne Boleyn is a figure who is rarely shown in films or series about this, arguably one of the most famous women in history. She got a small piece of recognition in The Other Boleyn Girl. But today, I want to talk about her in a bit more detail, because it's clear that she played an important role in Anne's life and had a significant influence on this entire story. Anne Boleyn's mother was named Elizabeth Boleyn, but she was born a Howard. Yes, the same Howard family as Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, who was later executed. And that's no coincidence. Elizabeth was Catherine Howard's aunt, since Catherine's father was her brother, which makes the two executed Queen's cousins. The Howards were an extremely powerful family, with royal blood tracing back to Edward I of England. After Henry VII of England came to the throne, they became closely connected to the royal court, and the daughters of the family were sent to serve the new Queen, Elizabeth of York. Among them was Elizabeth herself. So, you could say that she knew her future son-in-law almost from infancy, watching him grow up while serving his mother. Sometime between 1498 and 1499, Elizabeth married Thomas Boleyn, a young courtier and diplomat who was also building an ambitious career at the court of Henry VII. Soon, she became the mother of 3 children, Mary Boleyn, George Boleyn, and Anne, all of whom would go on to play a significant role in history. Elizabeth was very involved in her children's upbringing. It's believed that she gave Anne her early education, teaching her to play musical instruments, to sing and dance, as well as to read and write, and even giving her the basics of the French language. And this is particularly interesting because even though, for example, Anne's mother and Jane Seymour's mother moved in similar social circles, Jane did not receive the same kind of education. In fact, she is known to have struggled with writing and was mainly trained in traditional domestic skills expected of a noblewoman. After the death of Henry VII and the accession of his son, Elizabeth remained at court, serving Catherine for many years. There were long-standing rumours that since Elizabeth was considered quite an attractive woman, Henry VIII might have had an affair with her when he was still very young, but this is nothing more than a myth. And we even know where that rumour comes from. When Henry was trying to obtain legal permission to marry Anne Boleyn, the courtier George Throckmorton claimed that the king had meddled with the mother and the sister, to which Henry replied, "Never with the mother." So no, nothing ever happened between Henry and his future mother-in-law. Otherwise, it would have been rather ironic if he had somehow managed to be involved with nearly every woman in that family. When Henry became interested in Anne, it was Elizabeth who accompanied her at court, acting almost like a chaperone, keeping an eye on the propriety of their relationship. She remained part of Anne's household even after Anne became queen, and took part in important moments in the life of her granddaughter, Elizabeth I of England, who was possibly even named in her honour, as well as after Henry's mother. And it seems that Anne and her mother had a genuinely warm relationship. We even have Anne's own words. In one account of her final days, she is said to have cried out, "Oh, my poor mother, thou wilt die with sorrow." That brief, anguished line says a lot. Anne understood that her mother was suffering just as deeply as she was. What Elizabeth went through in those days, when both of her children were imprisoned in the Tower and awaiting their deaths, we simply don't know. No records have survived of her writing to Henry or begging him for mercy. Most likely, as a woman of her time, she had very few means of influence and nothing left but to endure it. But perhaps one of the cruelest blows of all was this. Her own brother, Thomas Howard, presided over the trials of Anne and George Boleyn as Lord High Steward and even pronounced their sentences. After the executions of Anne and George, Elizabeth disappeared completely from view. She never returned to court, and her name no longer appears in any royal records. She died less than 2 years later, in April 1538, at the Boleyn family estate in Hever Castle, most likely never having truly recovered from the loss of her children. And although we know very little about how she coped with that grief, she did leave behind one final, telling decision. She chose not to be buried alongside her husband, but instead found her resting place in the Howard family tomb. Perhaps, in some quiet way, it was a statement that she no longer wished to share eternity with him. Elizabeth Boleyn's story is a striking example of life in the Tudor era, where you could rise to the very heights of royal favour and then fall just as quickly into disgrace and obscurity. And I can't help but feel that out of all of Henry's mothers-in-law, Elizabeth may have been the most unfortunate, because that same red-haired boy she had once known as a child, the one she had seen growing up, would, in the end, decide the fate of all 3 of her children, taking the lives of 2 of them. She paid the highest price of all. Have you ever heard anything about the mother of Jane Seymour? Most likely just one thing, that she was fertile. And yet she wasn't just the mother of Henry's 3rd wife, but also the grandmother of the king, Edward VI. Still, Marjorie Wentworth remains very much in the shadows of history. And while preparing this video, I practically had to dig out even the smallest mentions of her. I don't think it will surprise you if I say that Marjorie was also related to Elizabeth, Anne's mother, because, as usual, all the aristocrats of that time were somehow connected. The 2 women were half first cousins, and just like Elizabeth, Marjorie also had Edward III of England among her ancestors. What's interesting is that while Jane herself was not particularly described as a great beauty, in fact, she was once referred to as no great beauty. Her mother, in her younger years, was praised in poetry by John Skelton and described as a strikingly beautiful woman with excellent manners. And just like Elizabeth Boleyn, she also served at the court of Elizabeth of York in her youth, which means she likely saw Henry as a small child as well, long before he would go on to play such a decisive role in the fate of her family. Marjorie married Jane Seymour, a man who was somewhat below her in rank and came from the provincial gentry. But their marriage was often described as a happy and, by Tudor standards, a very successful one. They had 10 children, 7 of them boys. And that, of course, was no small detail for Henry, when he began considering Jane as a potential wife, because if the mother is fertile, then the daughter might be too. But behind this seemingly perfect marriage, there was also a scandal. Sir John is believed to have had an affair with his own daughter-in-law, Catherine Fillol, the wife of his son Edward, sometime between 1527 and 1529. Some even suspected that he might have been the father of her children, since Edward later declared them illegitimate and removed them from the line of inheritance. And as soon as this scandal became public, Jane's own engagement to William Dormer was broken off. So, as you can see, Jane's fate, and the fate of her entire family, could have turned out very differently, if not for sheer chance. If Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII hadn't happened to visit their estate in 1536, Jane might never have appeared at court as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. And perhaps, in the end, Jane's mother played a crucial role in this story, because it was her upbringing that helped her daughter capture the king's heart. Her famous modesty and obedience, so appealing to Henry after his turbulent marriages with Catherine and Anne, were likely shaped by her mother's guidance. As I mentioned earlier, Marjorie didn't give her daughters an ambitious or highly intellectual education, but they were well trained in household management, needlework, and religious practice. In other words, they embodied the ideal of an English noblewoman, and that was probably exactly what Henry was looking for at that moment. We don't really know what Marjorie thought about the prospect of her daughter becoming queen, but judging by the example of the Boleyns, it was probably clear to the entire family that marrying the king was the fastest possible way to rise. And considering that Jane was, in a way, already seen as a bit of a late bride, she was around 27 at the time, Marjorie was most likely pleased with such a fate for her daughter. Marjorie was present at court during Jane's time as queen and was likely a witness to some of the most important moments of her life. Her daughter's marriage, the preparations for her coronation, which, as we know, never actually took place, and the birth of Edward VI. And interestingly, Marjorie was only the second of Henry's mothers-in-law he actually had any real contact with. As you remember, Isabella never truly crossed paths with him, but both Elizabeth and Marjorie were present in the lives of their daughters, and therefore in his as well. As for the other 3, Henry never met them at all. Still, outside of official occasions, Marjorie seems to have preferred to stay away from court, spending most of her time at her family estate, especially after her husband's death in 1536. So Henry didn't have that many chances to play the role of a son-in-law. But very soon, the Seymours were struck by devastating grief, at the very moment of their greatest rise. Jane died just 12 days after giving birth to the long-awaited son. Now, Marjorie was the grandmother of a future king, and the Seymours were forever tied to the Tudor dynasty through this child. Almost overnight, they became the most powerful family in the country. Jane had secured her family's future at the cost of her own life. We don't know what Marjorie thought as she watched her daughter being laid to rest, but most likely, like any mother, she struggled deeply to come to terms with the loss of her own child. After Henry's death, she became the grandmother of the king himself, a position of the highest honour. Her son, Edward Seymour, became Lord Protector of England, and her son Thomas Seymour married Henry's widow, Catherine Parr. the Seymours had reached the very top, rising from the provincial gentry all the way to the centre of power, by the time Marjorie died at the age of 72. And perhaps it was for the best that she died when she did, without seeing what came next. How her own grandson would order the execution of her son Thomas, and how that same boy, the one whose life had cost her daughter so much, would die himself before reaching the age of 16. And this is where I suggest we pause, because we've reached the halfway point of Henry's wives. I'll tell you about the mothers of the other three in part 2, if, of course, you enjoyed this one. So let me know in the comments if you want a part 2. And before you go, I want to ask you something. Would you have given your own daughter in marriage to Henry VIII? Share your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.